I'm going to show you game 2 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana in a little bit more detail than the quick report that has already been uploaded. But if you want to check that out with some nice pictures, then take a look at the link up there. So here we go, game 2, Carlsen with the white pieces. Interesting to see how the players would react after the marathon of game 1. Carlsen d4 knight f3, pretty solid, matched by Fabiano, and Magnus goes for, well, a main line by his standards, offering a queen's gambit, and here Fabiano just plays the solid queen's gambit declined. Well done, I approve of that opening with black. And the bishop f4 variation, well, this has been very well analysed. And it's in some ways it's a very old move, but can lead to very, very complex positions as well. So an interesting choice from Magnus. And here, well, knight d7 is possible, b6 is possible, but c5 is kind of the old main line. Black takes the opportunity to strike at white's centre. And black can get away with this at a very early stage because the bishop is on f4, not on g5. On g5 that would be problematic. So white takes. Recapture. This is all absolutely normal. And now there are some very, very complex lines after Castle's queen side, very old variation, but Carlsen went for rook d1, which is also one of the main lines actually. And here the normal moves are bishop e7 or rook e8. But Fabiano selected rook d8. Now, as he said after the game, this is actually a very old move, but somehow it's just fallen completely out of fashion. I mean, in many ways it's a very logical move, of course, that black sometimes wishes to push forward with d4. Sometimes just exchange here. Carlsen had to kind of break his stride at this moment and have a think about. He was obviously not very familiar with the move. Well, as he said, the most testing move here is knight d2 to try and hassle the queen bishop, and also sometimes simply to be able to recapture on c4 with the knight. But he felt that he could be running into some of Caruana's opening preparation, and he simply didn't want to risk what is potentially a very sharp line. So he played a very unpretentious move, simply bishop e2, hoping to get a slight advantage. Fabiano reacted very quickly, knight e4, so taking the fight to Magnus. And here, well, one could exchange on d5 and simply castle. And then let's say h6 to prevent anything nasty with knight g5. Knight d4, well, perhaps white is slightly better here, but I think the reason that Magnus didn't exchange on d5 is because it opens up this bishop's diagonal. So if we come back here, you can see that pawn stands on e6 blocking the bishop, making it less easy for black to develop. And that's why Magnus played castle's kingside. Knight exchange on c3. h6 again, preventing any nasty threat with knight g5. Remember that queen stands there. Very common theme in queen's pawn openings. And again, Magnus could exchange on d5, but clearly didn't want to open the path for the bishop. Instead he played a4. But knight e7 was a clever reply from Fabiano, and he was still playing very quickly actually. And Magnus admitted after the game that he'd underestimated this move. And one basic point is that if pawn takes pawn, then black doesn't need to recapture with the pawn, but with the knight instead, attacking the bishop and this pawn here. And Magnus missed something else a little bit later on as well. After knight e5, he'd kind of missed bishop d6 at all, which is a slightly unusual way of playing, that black first retreats the knight, then the bishop, hasn't bothered developing this queen's bishop. But there's a kind of semi-threat here. If bishop f3, then the queen comes back to c7, and that's a bit unpleasant. So Magnus exchanged on d5 and knight d5. Well, the knight arrives at exactly where it wants to. Centre of the board, attacking the bishop and the pawn. And here is another, this is actually quite a big moment in the game, where the game can turn in different directions, very different directions. And Magnus thought for some time here, I mean, Fabiano really had a huge chunk of a time advantage here. So the critical move is, well, first of all, I should say, much earlier on, Magnus had simply overlooked that knight c4 isn't winning. So this was his intention from way back. But of course, he'd realised that black is absolutely fine after this move. And after the exchange of queens, well, because this one drops with check, then black is more than fine in this position. Check. No, the interesting move here is to sacrifice a knight, at least temporarily. Knight takes pawn. Well, this obviously has to be captured because of the threats here. Oh, well, I say that. What about knight takes bishop? This is a nice line. So this involves a lot of calculation. But, I mean, this one is fairly simple. Just leads to a position where white is picking up material with the pin. Okay, so king takes, more or less forced. I think it is forced in that position. So white exchanges, gives a check, and then plays e4. So you can see it was a temporary piece sacrifice. White is winning back material because of the pin on the d file. In fact, black has quite a few options in this position. It's really interesting. One is simply to play bishop d7. And after pawn takes, well, black has several options. It's possible to take this pawn with the bishop, with the queen, or simply to play pawn takes pawn. But I mean, it's all very, very complicated. But in principle, I think this is the kind of position that Magnus would like, because black's king only has 2 pawns in front of it. I mean, it's really complicated. One has to calculate a lot. So, for example, bishop takes pawn, then queen a2 is the only move, just obviously to pin so that bishop takes rook isn't possible. And then bishop g4, and obviously, well, what's the score? White is 1 pawn down, but with very, very nice pieces. But, I mean, this is a messy position. But the other way of playing for black, sorry, let me just get back to this position, is actually after e4 to move the knight. And after rook takes rook, queen takes. Now, we have a material count of bishop and knight against rook and pawn. If black could bring this rook into the game, if we could magically lift it to f8, then black would simply be better, possibly even winning. But after this check, of course, it's not so clear. Black can hope to develop with b6 and bishop b7. There's also some kind of counter-attack with queen and knight on the king side. I mean, maybe this is what Fabiano had in mind, but it's still a really tricky position. In any case, Magnus was scared off knight takes pawn. I'm sure he wanted to do it. Scared off, and he said after the game that he was very cautious here because obviously Fabiano was playing really quickly. This was all part of his opening preparation. So he was reluctant to go in for any of these sharp lines, which clearly Fabiano would have rehearsed very well indeed. So instead, Magnus decided to put the brakes on. Remember, this is a World Championship match. You don't gamble. He simply put the bishop on a good square on the long diagonal. Now, the problem with this is that it allows a simplification. The tactics don't work for black. You can't play this, for example. Yeah, knight takes pawn is actually very good, and so on. Let me see. Let's go back. Yes, and knight takes pawn allows knight c4, attacking lots of things. So basically, in this position, this move is more or less forced. But I mean, this is really what black wants, because he manages to exchange off these active pieces and get to a position where white's pawns are potentially vulnerable. Of course, Magnus knew exactly what he was doing. He was simplifying. He didn't want to risk much, and he realized that although he could be slightly worse here, in fact this is a tenable position because white's pieces are active enough. There's some pressure on this pawn here, and it takes black a little bit of time to untangle. If you're greedy, you can be worse here. Queen takes pawn, queen here prevents black's bishop from developing, and then rook d1, preventing bishop d7. So instead of that, Fabiano played very prudently with rook b8. And now, because the b pawn's protected, then this bishop can come out. So the bishop finally emerges and neutralizes this one. And here, well, because of these somewhat weak pawns, white has to be careful, and actually Magnus took no chances here at all. You know, you could exchange, but well, in this kind of position, white is slightly worse because of the pawns. Also, it's annoying that white has to solve the back rank problem. Black is very slightly better. So Magnus took no chances and simplified into a rook and pawn endgame, where white has really ugly pawns, but basically just enough activity to force a drawn position. So here it would be a mistake to protect that pawn, because the king comes to attack c5 very easily. So a6. Basically, Magnus had foreseen this absolutely forced sequence, which succeeds in liquidating all the pawns on the queen side, and that leaves black with the advantage on the king side, but not enough to win the game. So it's clear black is going to win this pawn, and in fact Magnus just gives it up. If king takes pawn, then f4 trades down into a 3 versus 2, and as we saw yesterday, that is definitely a draw, even though yesterday's position was a little bit uncomfortable for Fabiano, but he defended very, very easily. This one would be a total draw. That's dead easy. So Fabiano played f5, so that's in order to meet f4 with e4. Then black at least has some nice pawns, but Magnus played this excellently. He played it very, very quickly. He gave that pawn, well, this pawn is going to drop because the rook can come over. So he gave the pawn and just defended this position, just kept an active rook. And it's actually very well known, this 4 versus 3 position, even though white has really ugly pawns. In fact, defensively they're quite good, because it means black can never create a passed pawn. It's just worth remembering. That can be checked, the king can be checked away, so if the king goes back, black has achieved nothing. Of course, e4 is possible, and that was the move that was played, but black is exchanging more pawns, and this is a simple draw. active rook. The king can't make any progress because there'd be a rook b3 check. And black can make absolutely no progress in this position. I mean, of course, Fabiano tried a little bit to win this endgame, but he didn't push too hard. And the players were playing very quickly. This is actually a simpler endgame than yesterday. So the game ended after about 3 hours play in a draw. Honours are even after 2 games. One felt that there was maybe a little bit of energy lacking in this game. But it was more that, yeah, Magnus kind of messed up the opening, or was caught a little bit in the opening, but not so seriously. In fact, both players, I have to say, looked very fit today. And when I asked about that in the press conference, they said, of course, a little bit tired after yesterday, but actually they both felt really good and it had no adverse effect on them. That was their take. They're obviously been in training and both extremely fit, coming physically and mentally coming into this match. So if you like this channel, please subscribe. You'll see the button. No, it's down there, isn't it? The button's down there. And don't forget to click on the links. If you want to see more games by Carlsen and Caruana, click on the link up there. And there are lots of other playlists too for you to discover. And if you want to support us on Patreon, then please do click through and check out the rewards. Thanks for watching.